Welcome back to Opinionated as we try and handle this heavy topic of terrorism today, counter-terrorism and the portrayal of terrorism. Our in-studio guest for this segment is Alex Whisson, a Perth-based, well-known independent journalist, also with RTR FM, and a social justice advocate, stalwart of many years. Our crossover guest will be researcher and lawyer Katie Batty, prize-winning law graduate with 8 years' experience in the unions. To start, and firstly, we'll be going to a clip of Noam Chomsky, featuring Noam Chomsky, which will frame the discussion that we'll be coming back with, and his definition of terrorism.
Well, the phrase war on terrorism should always be used in quotes, because there can't possibly be a war on terrorism. It's impossible. The reason is it's led by one of the worst terrorist states in the world. In fact, it's led by the only state in the world which has been condemned by the highest international authorities for international terrorism, namely the World Court, the Security Council, except that the U.S. vetoed the resolution. So we cannot even talk about a war on terrorism without self-ridicule. Whatever's going on, you can like it or you can hate it or whatever, but it's not a war on terrorism, it's some other thing. Well, what's the role of, what was it, Latin America? In this other thing, whatever it is. Latin America has been the target of most U.S. terrorism for obvious reasons. It's close by. And it's kind of interesting to read the Latin American press and to see their reaction to the September 11th atrocities. Everyone condemned them, at least everyone I read, said, you know, terrible atrocities, you know, we've got to catch the criminals and so on. But invariably, there was a little footnote, like in Panama, the press said, yeah, these were horrible atrocities, but they're not unfamiliar to us. And they referred to the bombing of the Barrio Chorrillo by George Bush Sr., which killed, according to them, about 3,000 people in this poor neighborhood in one bombing. This was during what was called Operation Just Cause in 1989, an invasion of Panama to kidnap a kind of minor thug who had stepped out of line and was brought back to the United States, where he was sentenced and is now in jail for crimes, most of which he committed while he was on the CIA payroll. Now, that was Operation Just Cause. The Panamanians remember it a little bit differently, including, for example, this one terrorist atrocity, which, according to them, killed several thousand people. In Nicaragua, the Jesuit University has a major research journal, Bio, one of the major research journals in the region. They described the September 11th atrocities as Armageddon. They said, this is like Armageddon, they're so awful. But then they added, of course, we have suffered our own Armageddon, namely the killing of tens of thousands of people, the devastation of the country. It may never recover. It's now the second poorest in the hemisphere. Those were the crimes of international terrorism for which the U.S. was condemned by the World Court, so they remember that. And so it goes throughout the region.
Well, once again, welcome back to Opinionated. We're here with Alex Whisson. Soon we'll be with Katie Batty. Alex, you've just listened to Noam Chomsky and his definition of terrorism and who he constitutes as the real terrorists. What's your view?
Well, I mean, I think Professor Chomsky's statements are tremendously important in terms of establishing the wider historical context of terrorism. The fact is the United States, for instance, has not ratified the Rome Treaty, which gave rise to the International Criminal Court. Its Congress passed something called the Escape the Hague Act. Now, it's important to ask why that might be, and my argument would be is because they don't want to see their political leaders, their military leaders, responsible for crimes against humanity brought to justice in The Hague.
Are there crimes against humanity? You just said there's
I don't think that's too strong a way of putting it. The United States has been constantly at war since the end of the Second World War. It's launched invasions, occupations.
If it wasn't the United States, would it have been someone else?
I think it's in the nature of imperialism to really rape the earth for colonies, for markets, for raw materials. The United States is the latest phase of that. As I say, it's launched wars, occupations, coup d'etats. It's been responsible for bloodshed and mayhem throughout the Middle East, Africa, Asia and other parts of the world. And I'd like to come back to your earlier guest comments. I very much agree with Dr. Anne Alley's comments regarding the combination lock analogy. But I think there's a danger of having too microscopic a focus on the individual psychological factors that give rise to terrorism. There is a broader historical context here. If we look at the rise of the Islamic State specifically, clearly it stems to the invasion of Iraq. The sanctions regime in the 1990s that led to some 500,000 deaths, the subsequent war that, according to the medical journal Lancet, led to an estimated 1 million deaths. Iraqi society has been completely destroyed. I would argue that it's really a genocidal campaign.
So in terms of terrorism,
that's the context for terrorism.
terms of terrorism, is racism then used as a tool for exploitation?
I think we only have to look at our own government's statements, even in the last couple of days, where there's been this very brazen, open declaration that we are only going to look at Syrian Christians as refugees, despite the fact that many Muslims, ironically enough, are victims of Islamic State. There is a racist agenda that is fueled to dehumanise our enemies, our so-called enemies, to dehumanise Iraqi civilians, Syrian civilians. We are going to be bombing these people, let's not forget. So it is hypocritical for the Australian government to be claiming that Australia is a sanctuary for these people while bombing them. Yeah. There is a longer history as well of colonialism and occupation of lands like Palestine as well.
On the note of colonialism, oppressed dichotomies, you're talking about underlying factors. If the core issue is that these wars are being crafted, what's the underlying reason? Is it the accumulation of resources? Is it?
I think there's many factors involved, and we probably couldn't go into all the detail here.
But there must be a predominant reason that we're crafting all these wars.
Look, I think it's about control of markets. I think it's about corporate profits. I think it's about military domination. We're seeing the rise of China. The United States is expanding its military powers to counter the rise of China. And the people respond when their countries are being laid waste, opened up to markets, their cultures debased. Their history is disrespected. People respond likewise, whether it's non-violent resistance or terrorism. So one point I think that's crucial is the state cannot be absolved of responsibility for terrorism.
Absolutely.
The state actually creates the conditions for terrorism by foreclosing the possibility of peaceful resolution of conflict, by foreclosing the possibility of democracy. Violence is inevitable.
Mass propaganda is a powerful tool. Mass propaganda is a powerful tool. How can we challenge?
Look, I think if you look at the response of ordinary Australians in recent days to the European refugee crisis, I think many of your viewers would find that very heartening. What it demonstrates to me is that at a very base, fundamental human level, most people are decent-minded. Most people have love and compassion in their heart, and when they see people suffering, they extend a hand of friendship. Ultimately, when people get to know Muslims, their brothers and their sisters...
Let me be the devil's advocate. Let me be the devil's advocate. A little child washing up on a beach, heartbreaking. What about 26 million to 30 million refugees, 20, 30 years chronically in refugee camps, displaced? What about the camps, Dadaab? Why haven't we responded to that?
Look, well, I think one aspect of that, Gerry, and we have to be honest about that, is that it can be overwhelming. And there is an element of fear that I wouldn't say is justified, but people think there are 30 million refugees in the world. Goodness me, they can't all come here. We can't accommodate them all. There is that element. There is the element of the complexity of the politics. The complexity of the political situation in the Middle East is absolutely formidable. It's difficult for people to perhaps comprehend where these refugees come from, why they are seeking sanctuary in the first place. But what I would say is that rich Western countries have a responsibility. We do have the capacity to accommodate a lot more refugees. And actually, again, extending that hand of friendship actually will reduce the prospects of terrorism. If Middle Eastern people can see that we are true to our values of democracy, as we say we are, and we provide them sanctuary and we assist them in their own fight for democracy in their home countries, then that will actually drain the swamp, if you like, drain the swamp, which gives rise to groups like the Islamic State.
Okay, thank you, Alex. And we'll have Alex Whisson back for the last segment with Dr. Anne Alley. We'll go to Katie Batty, lawyer and social justice advocate. Katie, you've heard a lot of the discussion here today. What are your views on the portrayal of terrorism and the definition of terrorism?
I think it's really interesting because we've really seen a shift in how things are framed as far as terrorism. Terrorism is really used as this political tool. Well, a lot of, like Alex was talking about, the International Criminal Court, and the US refuses to submit to that jurisdiction. A lot of what is called terrorism these days is crimes against humanity or war crimes. And terrorism is a very political term that can be used to frame that based on certain ideologies. We have the Kurdish Workers' Party at the moment fighting against IS. They're designated as a terrorist organisation by Australia, the EU, the US, and yet they're a secular left-wing organisation that's helping and has rescued thousands of people. They're seen as being part of this terrorism thing, but what happens is that we don't have these countries being brought forward to the International Criminal Court. We don't have the US going to the International Criminal Court.
On that note, Rosie, when international instruments don't have the capacity to subordinate nations that are, allegedly wrongdoing, what is our hope? What is our great hope? What is the way forward?
Well, when people criticise international law, you have to remember that international law is constructed by states consensually, and states are very concerned to preserve their own sovereignty and their own rights, and that's why it's limited. The Refugee Convention, it took the horror of World War II, it took the horror of it happening, should I say, in the Western world and to white people, for international law to finally develop around refugees. Even then, it was very limited to civil and political rights, which is what the Western states were pushing forward. So I think it's difficult to, when we criticise international law, we have to look at the states and say, why is it that the states don't want to hold others to account? Why is it that we have African nations going to International Criminal Court, but we're not going to see the US go in there or Australia go in there?
Many people actually ask that question about African nations and non-Western nations that are finishing up in the criminal courts in The Hague. But, so what is the way forward to get these other nations forward? How do we actually change the terms of reference?
I think what you see in Europe with their own European court, and perhaps this sense of wanting to keep an eye on each other and keep each other in line, even though there gets tensions in there, I think that's a good thing, to have this sense of community. I mean, the African Union, for example, they've got a broader definition of what a refugee is, because the refugee definition as it stands definitely excludes third world people fleeing civil war and conflict. It's very focused on the Western idea of civil and political rights. I think if Australia, if we perhaps regionally start to broaden our ideas and our concepts around that, perhaps then internationally we can work to that. We definitely have a culture that's internationally, we're looking about negotiation. And I think it's been good to see Australia start to step into the international arena, going to the talks in Geneva at the UNHCR, and start to talk about where do we stand internationally on this issue, because I've been to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, and Australia is embarrassing in the way that it refuses to acknowledge these international issues, and finally it's starting to do that. Well,
Australia, will the next government, if this is a dying government, make any difference?
I think that the Labor Party is often looking to the polls and seeing what works. I think it's on us, it's on the Australian people to say we do want to have things more humanely. It's unbelievable, Abbott said, with 14,000 Syrian refugees permanently resettled. No one can get permanently resettled right now. We've got temporary protection visas. They're going to be permanently resettled. We're going to bring them over on planes. Of course, we can stop people drowning at sea. The answer is not to stop the boats. The answer is to have a humane program, and that's possible. And also greater funding for the UNHCR, which has such limited funding annually, about $5 billion, to stop people having to risk their lives and all these kinds of things.
Rosie, Katie, thank you for coming on the show, and we'll have to have you back again. It was good listening to you.
Great.
We'll be back after the short commercial break to listen to Alex Whisson once again, and Dr. Anne Alley wrap up the show with a summary of the ways forward.